November 1938. For days, the young Turkish Republic has been paralyzed. Mustafa Kemal, the founder of modern-day Turkey, a man named Atatürk, the father of all Turks by his people for his services to the nation, is dead. On the 10th of November, shortly after 9 o'clock in the morning, the victorious soldier, patriot, and visionary politician closes his eyes forever. The body is then moved from Istanbul to Ankara, the capital, where it finds a temporary resting place in the Ethnographic Museum. Exactly 10 years later, on the 10th of November 1953, Kemal Atatürk begins his final journey. His body, accompanied by the sounds of Chopin's funeral march, is finally laid to rest in a special mausoleum built for him on Mount Rasatepe. The plans were laid by a Turkish architect called Emin Onat in cooperation with a number of German colleagues. And once again, an entire country takes sad leave from the man who marked and altered the course of the history of the Turkish nation like no other. Soldiers from elite units draw the body on a carriage through the streets of Ankara. At the front, the Independence Medal, which Atatürk was awarded for his services to the nation, is carried with honor. The first person walking behind the coffin is Atatürk's sister, Makbule, and she's followed by the entire military and political establishment. Prime Minister Celal Bayar, Refik Koraltan, the parliamentary president, the main parliamentary representative, Adnan Menderes, ex-state president İsmet İnönü, and the Turkish generals were all there to pay their last respects to a president who died much too early. The huge gathering of foreign diplomats, military men, parliamentary representatives, and religious holders of high decorations pay tribute to the respect that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk managed to gather far beyond the borders of Turkey for his years of effort for his cause. The funeral procession slowly winds its way past the parliamentary building in which Atatürk called for Turkish independence and spoke to the nation on a number of occasions. Before the sarcophagus is finally laid to rest in the underground crypt within the mausoleum, Prime Minister Celal Bayar reminds the huge congregation of the tremendous achievements of the late state founder. In order to understand why the Turkish people hold so much respect for Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and his achievements during his lifetime, we have to go back in history. We go back to the year 1881. In May of this year, a baby boy is born in Salonika, the son of a customs official called Ali Riza Bey, and his wife, Subida Hanim. The parents decide to call him Mustafa. Salonika, which was founded in the year 315 before Christ and named after the sister of Alexander the Great, was the former capital of the Thessalonica Empire. And Thessalonica probably gave young Mustafa a feeling for historical greatness quite early on. The fortified military harbour, the imposing buildings, and the hustle and bustle in the streets and squares still hinted at the former importance the city had had. Politically speaking, Salonika belonged to the time of the Osman Empire, which was founded in 1299 by Osman Bey and the Osman dynasty. Osman Bey himself stemmed from the so-called Oghuzan, the Turkish warrior people who had their roots back in Asia Minor. This aggressive nomadic people called themselves Turks or Türks, and the name came from the word Türke, meaning the strong. Osman's successors swept into the Balkans and captured Constantinople in 1453, formerly Byzance, adopting the city as the capital of their empire. In the decades that followed, the empire went on to conquer Serbia, Greece, Bosnia and Albania, which then became Osman provinces. Even the Khanate of the Crimean Tatars and Moldavia became vassal states within the empire. From 1640 onwards, the leaders of the Osman Empire adopted the title Caliph, which comes from the Arabic word Khalifa, or successor, with direct links to the Prophet Muhammad. The Osman Empire as a feudal military state was very similar to the later absolute states in Europe. The leaders at that time paid particular attention to the army, which on the other hand secured their political power. Special importance was given to the Janissaries, which were formed by Sultan Orhan in 1329 and were fanatical infantrymen. The members of this elite military body were mainly young men from Christian peoples with no private lives who lived in special barracks, were converted to the Islamic faith and trained in the military arts. They owed their allegiance to the Turkish rulers alone and were renowned for storming enemy strongholds with their curved swords shouting Allahu Akbar, or Allah is great. It was in the 16th and 17th centuries that these elite troops, totaling around 150,000 men, achieved their greatest importance. Following a military revolt, Sultan Mahmud II ordered them to be disbanded and eradicated in 1826. Apart from the military, the Islamic faith was also a cornerstone of the Osman Empire, because the Caliph position held by the Osman leaders also imposed religious power over the people. Sultan Suleiman I, who also went down in history as Kanuni, or the lawmaker, marked the high point of the empire's power. In Europe, he was simply known as the Splendid One, a direct reference to his immense wealth. During his reign of power, Rhodes, Mesopotamia with Baghdad, parts of Dalmatia and Yemen were conquered. The planned conquest of Vienna failed to materialize. The city was called the Golden Apple of the Germans by the famous Turkish writer Evliya Çelebi. A second attempt to take over the city. The great vizier Kara Mustafa, who dreamt of Vienna becoming the Osman metropole, was even given aid by France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, sent specialists to aid the Osman Empire forces, who were skilled at building tunnels under fortified positions. But all his efforts were in vain. Vienna managed to stand firm. The defeat in Vienna in 1683 against the Emperor's army led by Prince Eugen produced cracks in the history of the Osman Empire's facade. The apparent weakness and vulnerability of the former world power motivated a number of enemies at home and abroad to try and push through their own interests. The end of the Osman Empire's expansionist ambitions helped to improve relations between the Turks and the Germans. Frederick the Great became the first German leader to sign a pact with the Osman Empire. It was in 1761 that he signed an alliance agreement with Sultan Mustafa III. 2 years later, Ahmet Resmet Efendi became the first Turkish diplomat in Berlin, and 1789 saw a group of Prussian military advisors begin work in Istanbul. It was in 1835 that the Prussian General Staff Officer Helmut Graf von Moltke was seconded for a 4-year period to the Osman Empire, to fulfill the special wish of Sultan Mahmud II for the reformation of the Turkish army. Later, he was awarded the honorary title of Baron Bey for his services to the country. A monument erected in his honor can still be seen today in Tarabya Park in Istanbul. While the Germans were interested in peaceful cooperation, other European states were using the weaknesses displayed by the Osman Empire for their own ends. There was little to see of the former power and glory of the Ottoman Empire at this point in history. Sultan Abdülhamit II had been in power since 1876 after staging a coup. He ruled the empire now forced onto the defensive. Hopes that wide-reaching social reforms would be introduced during his rule soon turned out to be an illusion. Quite the opposite, in fact. Press censorship was intensified to counter oppositional ideas, and a powerful secret police service was created. Relations with Germany, on the other hand, remained the same. Abdülhamit II graciously received the German emperor on a number of occasions. In 1890, a German-Turkish friendship, trade and shipping agreement came into effect. Then, in 1902, the construction of the Baghdad Railway began, whereby the Orient Express route should be extended from Hamburg to Basra. A few years later, Junkers opened scheduled flights between Berlin and Ankara. Cooperation was also increasing in the field of science. Famous German archaeologists and historical researchers traveled to the Ottoman Empire to carry out excavation work together with local experts. The discovery and excavation of Troy, the Ishtar Gate in Babylon, and the Pergamum altar were highlights of these successful years. The more successful the cooperation between the Germans and the Turks became, the more alarm bells began to ring in Paris and London. The previous years had seen England and France take over large stretches of territory in the Near East, and future planning centered on conquering the entire area between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. German-Turkish cooperation was not exactly opportune. The era in which young Mustafa was born marked the blackest period of the Ottoman Empire. The former control over European territory, which once stretched as far as Vienna, had dwindled away to a small strip of territory from Albania via Epirus and Macedonia to Thrace. To the south, where conquered territory had stretched as far as Central Africa and the eastern parts of the Mediterranean, only Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, and parts of the Arab Peninsula remained under Ottoman administration. Mustafa, who lives with his parents in the Muslim quarter of Salonika called Ahmet Subashi, is blonde and has blue eyes like his mother. Following the deaths of the first 3 children, the parents take great care of the newly born child and the 3 sisters who follow. The lad develops into a quiet loner who observes and analyzes everything going on around him intensely. Attaining school age, Mustafa attends a religious school because his mother wants it. But a few weeks later, his father advises him to switch to the Semzi Efendi school, which uses modern teaching methods. And it was here that he gets an excellent education. Following the early death of a husband and one of 2 daughters, Mustafa's mother is forced to carry on alone. The family lived with an uncle in the country for a short time. Then, just a few months later, the family moved to an aunt who lived in Salonika. Mustafa attended a state school until he was able to pass the entrance examination for one of the new military academies in 1893, the so-called Rushdiya, and was accepted. A teacher of mathematics who noticed the unusual talents of the young man gave him the additional name Kemal, the knowledgeable one. The academy had the declared aim of providing a broad-based modern education to young officer cadets who were expected to provide new impulses for the old-fashioned Ottoman army. The Germans keenly supported these aims. Colmar Freiherr von Goltz, an experienced veteran of the German War of Independence and a military historian of considerable note, advised the Turks on the important issues that cropped up. He died of fever he contracted on the front in 1916. The Turks, who still consider him to be the immortal master tactician of the Osman army, honored him with the title Golds Pasha. His grave can be found today in the German cemetery on a piece of high ground near the Bosphorus. A rare section of film footage dating back to 1917 shows the visit of the German Kaiser to the cemetery. Mustafa Kemal's further progress appeared to be predestined. Once he graduated from the military academy, he took and passed the entrance examination for the senior military academy in Monastir, the capital of the Osman province of West Macedonia. Around about this time, a new political awareness was surfacing in army officers' establishments. Because they found the army-dominated structures of Sultan Abdülhamit II outdated, they began to organize themselves in private circles, where they secretly discussed their ideas. As fate would have it, it was in the Sultan-supported military establishments that a new opposition was growing, who gave him the blame for the military defeats and the growing signs of state bankruptcy. Foreign language tuition gave the young officers the chance to read books that opened up new worlds for them. They called themselves Young Turks and focused their attention on the political and social developments taking place in the Western European nations. Abdülhamit registered these new developments with concern. His fear of a possible coup was so great that he even had a new residence built. 3 outer rings of protective walls and a palace guard totaling 15,000 men were designed to shield him from the anger of his people. His secret agents went looking for opponents and dragged off thousands of people to intern them in the infamous state prisons. Mustafa Kemal too was infected with the ideas of the Young Turks. After graduation, Mustafa Kemal applied for entrance to another senior military academy, this time the General Staff Academy in Istanbul. It was here that he met fellow students who were later to accompany him his whole life long. His interest in politics grew. In an organization called Fatherland and Freedom, he took over the job of editor for a publication called Vatan, in which he published his first patriotic articles. His main political thoughts tended to shine through in one article. "Wake up! What are you waiting for? Can't you see that the Turks are lying in chains? Your Turkey must be freed from foreign enemies and the unscrupulous civil servants who are plundering the country." After graduation from the General Staff Academy, he attained the rank of major. A short while later, his work for the underground publication Vatan brought him into conflict with the state authorities for the first time. He and some of his friends were imprisoned for weeks and later sent to Syria as a punishment posting. But his political work continued. In spite of Mustafa Kemal's sympathy for the Young Turks' renewal movement, there were still irreconcilable differences. The Young Turks were aiming for a greater Turkish empire, consisting of all Turkish-speaking peoples in Asia, which would continue to be ruled by a sultan. But Mustafa Kemal rejected this kind of state idea. He wanted a Turkish national state, and not multicultural expansionism. Even when the Young Turks staged a successful coup against Abdülhamit and installed his brother Mehmet as the new sultan, Mustafa Kemal remained reserved and kept his distance. In a letter to a friend, he wrote down his ideas for the future. The Sultanate must be destroyed. Religion and the state must be kept separate. We have to turn away from Eastern civilization and turn more to the West. We have to do away with the difference between a man and a woman and create a new social order. The Arabic way of writing, which also prevents us from taking part in Western civilization, has to be done away with. We need to develop an alphabet of our own, which is based on the Latin script. And we have to do everything, even as far as the clothing we wear, to move closer to the West. Believe me, one day all this will become reality. One day I will realize these revolutionary steps, and the people to whom I belong will believe me. Ataturk didn't mean that embracing Western civilization should mean abandoning Turkish culture. Quite the opposite. Just like the Spaniards followed Spanish culture, and the Germans did the same with German culture, a modern Turkey should accept its own cultural roots, cherish them, and develop them still further. The next decade of the Young Turk era was marked by internal strife and a number of bloody wars, which helped to weaken the Ottoman Empire still further. Tripoli was lost to the Italians in 1911. Mustafa Kemal saw action in Libya. He'd now been promoted to the rank of major and continually tried to organize resistance on the part of the Libyan people against the Italians. But it was all in vain. In 1912, during the First Balkan War, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece and Montenegro formed an alliance and managed to take back most of the territory in Europe occupied by the Ottoman Empire. The loss of the Balkans during the turmoil of these years led the Young Turks to adopt a new political aim. Osmanism should be replaced by the national idea of Turkism, which could be achieved with the aid of a strong army. In order to modernize the army, Enver Pasha, who was one of the leading figures in the Young Turk movement, and like Mustafa Kemal, a graduate of the military academy in Monastir, began to get more German military advisors into the country. It was a decision much criticized by Mustafa Kemal because he was convinced that the reorganization of the Turkish army should be done by the Turks. Dark clouds were beginning to gather across Europe. It was on the 28th of June 1914 that a Serb nationalist called Gafrian Princip shot the next in line for the Austrian-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. The echoes of the shots resounded all over Europe, and the entire continent trembled. Mobilization was carried out on all sides, and a short time later, the armies of the major European powers marched forward to take up positions. At first, the Ottoman Empire took up a neutral stance, but Enver Pasha, who sympathized with the German side because of an earlier appointment as a military attaché in Berlin, decided to line up with the Central Powers and thus took his country into the First World War. Germany and the Ottoman Empire signed a secret military agreement on the 2nd of August 1914. One day later, general mobilization took place in Turkey. The Germans sent a battle cruiser, the Goeben, and the Breslau, which was a small cruiser, to support their allies. Both warships arrived in Istanbul in early August and went out to engage Russian fortifications under the Ottoman flag. Mustafa Kemal, who was watching political developments in Sofia, was against the military alliance because he didn't see any need for it. It was on the 4th and the 5th of November that the Western powers declared war on the Ottoman Empire. At the beginning of 1915, British and French warships moved into position in the Dardanelles, the strait between the Aegean Sea and the Sea of Marmara. The specific aim of this large-scale naval action was to gain control of the straits as a precondition for sea connections with Russia. When Mustafa Kemal was given the order to take command of the 19th Reserve Division and to take part in the defense of the Dardanelles, he had no idea that this was to become a crucial turning point in his life. It was on the 19th of February that the Allied warships opened fire on the Turkish coastal defenses. At this point, Mustafa Kemal and his men had taken up positions on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The 18th of March, 1915. Large Allied warships attempt to break through the Straits of Dardanelles. The British War Minister Lord Kitchener and his naval commander Winston Churchill, who had played a part in planning the campaign, hadn't really expected any great resistance, but they were wrong. The attack failed under the pressure of fire from the Turkish coastal batteries and torpedo and mine attacks from German U-boats. The French warship Beauvais, as well as the British cruisers Irresistible and Ocean, were sunk, and a further 4 vessels damaged. In a further attempt to seize control of the Straits, the Allies launched a large-scale attack on Gallipoli with 81,000 men on the 25th of April. Without any hesitation, Mustafa Kemal seized the initiative and put his men in the path of the advancing British forces. Something that hadn't been thought possible took place. The British attack was repulsed. Even a second landing attempt on the southern peninsula near Al-Sitipi by Allied troops was halted by Turkish fire. At the end of the fighting, the Entente nations had suffered a serious defeat. The 1st of June saw Mustafa Kemal promoted to the rank of colonel for his successes and personal courage. Then, during the night of the 7th of August, the British made a third try to move behind the Turkish forces close to Suvla Bay, which is north of the strategic Aribono high ground. Once again, it was Mustafa Kemal who stood firm. There are eyewitness reports of how he led his troops forward and called on them to show courage in a hail of fire. His example helped his troops to stand firm even in the face of a gas attack intended to break resistance. Later, the international criticism of the British use of gas prompted Churchill to show his true colours when he said he couldn't understand the oversensitive reaction to the use of gas. He said he was definitely in favour of using it against uncivilized tribes. But even this weapon of war didn't help the British. At the end, the Turkish forces were able to register success. The battle for Gallipoli ended in a huge victory. Just how courageous the Turkish soldiers had been was mirrored in the loss of life. 90,000 dead and over 200,000 wounded was the price paid for victory. The real hero of Gallipoli was undoubtedly Mustafa Kemal. The Turkish newspapers described him euphorically as the saviour and hero of the fatherland. For the very first time, his name was mentioned all around the world. Later, in January 1916, as he took over command of the 16th Army Corps stationed in Edirne, where he was met by enthusiastic crowds of people. After another posting to the East Anatolian Front, he was later promoted to the rank of general on the 1st of April 1916 and was awarded the honorary title of Pasha. The situation of the Turkish forces fighting on the Eastern Front was dramatic. They didn't have enough weapons, ammunition, food and clothing. The men were worn out and ill. The war could not be won with men in this condition. In spite of a great deal of personal initiative, Mustafa Kemal could not halt the advance of the Russian Tsar's troops. The situation changed after the February Revolution in 1917. The Russian army too was tired. The political words of the Soviet revolutionaries promised peace, bread and prosperity, and this went down well with the tired troops. The Turkish army used the apparent breakdown symptoms within the Tsar's forces and launched an offensive which suddenly recaptured the East Anatolian territory. In spite of all this success, the war could no longer be won. The apparent collapse of the Ottoman Empire had produced political consequences within the country. The consequences? Rebels who considered the multinational Ottoman Empire as something forced on them conquered the Arab Peninsula with British help and called for national independence. When British troops occupied Baghdad, Mustafa Kemal was ordered to Syria once again. After inspecting his troops there, he discovered that their fighting power was seriously hampered by the lack of military equipment. He then said he was in favor of an orderly withdrawal, but his request was turned down. Mustafa Kemal withdrew from taking active military decisions in the middle of October 1917 in protest against the military policies being followed by the government in Istanbul. In a bid to get the popular critic away from Istanbul, the young Turk's successor to the throne, Mehmet Vahdettin, asked him to accompany him on a trip to visit the German allies. On the 16th of December, the Turkish group reached Spa, where they were received by Kaiser Wilhelm II, General Ludendorff, and the then head of the General Staff, General Field Marshal Hindenburg. Later, the delegation visited Berlin and returned to Istanbul on the 4th of January 1918. At this point in time, the outcome of the war had been militarily decided. It was on the 18th of January 1918 that the American President Woodrow Wilson published a 14-point program, which was intended as a basis for a forthcoming peace agreement. The program put forward the idea of a Turkish government for the areas of the former Ottoman Empire where Turks lived. Mustafa Kemal traveled to Vienna in June of the same year to find a cure for a painful kidney problem. His doctors ordered him to go to Karlsbad to take the waters for some months. During his stay in the modern spa town in Bohemia, with its healing waters from springs in the earth, Mustafa Kemal used the time for intensive thought about the future of his country and the personal role he would have to play in rebuilding it. His notebook, dating back to these times, contains all the basic ideas for social renewal in Turkey. Although his stay in the health resort was not actually completed, he returned to Istanbul on the 3rd of July 1918, following the death of Sultan Mehmed V and the appointment of a successor, Vahdettin's, as Sultan Mehmed VI. Shortly afterwards, the final act of the military conflagration unfolded. Using a number of tanks, the Allies managed to break through the German lines in the west on the 18th of July 1918. As the German forces staged a defensive retreat, the Entente forces breached the enemy lines on the Macedonian front. Bulgaria was forced to capitulate. The way to Istanbul lay open. The Ottoman Empire had been defeated. Leading young Turks, Talat and Enver Pasha resigned and left the country on board a German torpedo boat. It was on the 30th of October 1918 that the defeated Ottoman Empire signed the Mondros ceasefire agreement on Lemnos Island. The demands of the victors were a catastrophe for the losers. Turkey was pushed back to Anatolia. The Dardanelles and the Bosphorus were required to remain open for British and French warships. Manpower of the Turkish army was limited to 50,000 men, and the country itself was subject to rigorous financial and military controls. As the British occupied Iskenderun and the oil-rich region around Mosul on the 8th of November, it appeared that Turks had been reduced to a colonized people. General Mustafa Kemal Pasha, realizing that the Turkish people would never accept the will of the victorious powers, set about planning military resistance. Together with his friends, General Ali Fuat Cebesoy, General Kazim Karabekia, Marine Minister Rauf Orbay, and Colonel İsmet İnönü, he began to prepare armed resistance in Anatolia, where he'd been sent to take over the post of military inspector by the Sultan. The 15th of May 1919 saw Greek marine infantry landed near Izmir under the protection of Allied warships. Those responsible wanted to lay the foundations for a greater Greek empire. It came to fierce fighting during the occupation of Izmir, and many Turks were killed. Turkish flags were burnt and replaced with Greek ones. Fury was the best way to describe the feelings in Anatolia. Mustafa Kemal and his close followers landed in Samsun on the Black Sea coast on the 19th of May. He was then 38 years of age. It was a decisive step on the path to the national fight for freedom. He later celebrated the date of his arrival as his birthday. Mustafa Kemal began to rally the people around him without taking notice of the Sultan in Istanbul, who was becoming a marionette of the Allies. On the 22nd of June, he resigned his commission in the Ottoman Empire Army. He then went to Hausa and Amasya, and later to Erzurum. Here he held his first Freedom Movement Congress on the 23rd of July, and a second one was staged in Sivas. It was certainly his charismatic leadership qualities that helped him turn the resistance against the Allied occupation policies into a movement designed to achieve national independence. Mustafa Kemal's headquarters were set up in an agricultural school close to the small town of Ankara, and this became the center of national awakening. People began to follow his call for resistance all over the country and took up arms. As the first resistance took place, many young officers left Istanbul to join Mustafa Kemal's freedom movement. When the Sultan dissolved parliament in Istanbul because of his fear caused by the growing influence of the Turkish nationalists, Mustafa Kemal called for a great Turkish National Assembly in Ankara. That was on the 23rd of April 1920, and one day later it called on him to accept the post of president. Parallel to these events, the Allies meeting at a conference in San Remo had decided on the division of the Ottoman Empire territories from the Turkish homeland. In an attempt to overthrow the national movement, the Sultan set up a caliphate army, which he then moved against Mustafa Kemal's followers. The army was defeated, and the Freedom Army managed to push forward close to Istanbul. For the first time, Mustafa Kemal was controlling territory that lay under the direct control of the Sultan. The Greeks used the internal strife within the country to move ahead militarily with their territorial claims. Greek forces pushed into Anatolia and occupied the Turkish town of Balıkesir and the old Ottoman Empire capital Bursa. By the 27th of July, Greek army units had managed to take over Thrace and the town of Edirne. When Sultan Vahdettin signed a peace agreement with the victorious powers on the 10th of August 1920 in a Paris suburb called Sèvres, which more or less took away the national and political sovereignty from the Turkish state, the anger felt by the people became open rebellion. The contractual details, which were basically dictated by Britain, more or less meant the dissolution of the Turkish state. The European parts of Turkey, with the exception of Istanbul and the area around Izmir, went to Greece. Strategically important straits were to remain open for all merchant shipping and warships in both peace and war times. The eastern provinces, consisting of Erzurum, Altu, Van and Bitlis, were promised to the Armenians, and the French occupied Kilikien, Marash, Antep and Urfa, and the Italians gained the areas around Antalya, Aydin and Konya. For their part, the British gained control of the Turkish finances and the oil-rich territory around Mosul. The Turks themselves were left with a small strip of land around Ankara. The British Prime Minister Lloyd George, who played a role in working out the somewhat illegal German reparations demands at a conference in Versailles, described the agreement with Turkey as fair. He even went as far as to say the Turks would have to give up more territories than they'd earned. Mustafa Kemal and his friends categorically rejected the Sèvres Agreement. They broke off connections with the government in Istanbul and branded the 3 Turkish delegation members who'd signed the document as traitors. A wave of hate against the victorious powers was created as the details of the agreement became known. Mustafa Kemal summed up the general feelings when he said, "We will fight to the last man, and in the end, we will smash their plans over their heads." His strategic military concepts were concentrated at the time on 2 opponents: the Greeks, who occupied Thrace and parts of western Anatolia, and the Armenians, who were in control of the eastern part of Anatolia. The Armenians, having overestimated their military potential, had declared war on Turkey in September 1920 in order to secure the territory promised to them in the Sèvres Agreement. The turn in events came quickly. The Armenians were defeated within a few months, and the towns they had occupied were regained. The 2nd of December saw the defeated side sign an agreement in Gümrü, which laid down borders as the course of the rivers Arpachay and Aras. On the same day, Armenia joined the Soviet Union. For the very first time, Turkey and the Soviet Union had a common border. Friendship agreements signed between Ankara and Moscow produced finance and military aid. It all brought peace and quiet to eastern Anatolia. Now, Mustafa Kemal had time to pay attention to the Greek occupiers. He appointed the former head of the General Staff, Colonel İsmet, to Supreme Commander of the Northwestern Army. It was on the 10th of January 1921 that the first clash came with advancing Greek forces. It was in İnönü, a place name that Colonel İsmet later took as his family name. The Turkish troops gained the upper hand and forced the Greeks to return to their initial positions near Bursa. It was this retreat that caused the English-Italian-French front in the Orient to start to fall apart. The 20th of January 1921 saw the Greater National Assembly pass the first Turkish constitution. General Fevzi Çakmak was appointed Prime Minister. The Soviet Russians were the first country to recognize the new state. The Kemalists, as supporters of Mustafa Kemal, had achieved international recognition. It was a decisive step, but the fighting was still not over. The Greeks launched attacks again on the 23rd of March. Once again, İsmet İnönü managed to weather the storm. As his troops began to attack, the Greeks retreated. Mustafa Kemal thanked his general with the following words: "You have not only conquered the enemy, but also the unhappy fate of the nation." The situation took a turn for the better, and also on the diplomatic front. The British and French took up contact with Mustafa Kemal. In the meantime, they'd recognized that he alone was the leader of the Turkish nation. In spite of all this, the Greeks tried their luck on the battlefield once again. It was on the 9th of July 1921 that the Greeks set around 125,000 men in West Anatolia on the move in the direction of Ankara. Sure of success, King Constantine accompanied his troops to experience the advance. The Turkish forces were hopelessly outnumbered. They had little to counter the Greek tanks, airplanes and cannons, but their courage alone. As the National Assembly promoted Mustafa Kemal to Supreme Commander of the Turkish forces on the 5th of August 1921, it heralded a period of bloody fighting which ended on the 9th of September 1922 with the freeing of Izmir. Knowing too well that the very existence of Turkey was at stake, Mustafa Kemal pushed through emergency laws to enable a quick extension of the army. His convincing manner and his conviction that victory was certain helped to mobilize the people. There were no modern factories and production facilities available, so weapons and ammunition were made in the simplest manner by hand. There were no lorries, so women and girls carried equipment, food and munitions to the front. It didn't matter whether they were men or women, young or old. No one tried to avoid their patriotic responsibility to save their fatherland. Fighting raged and destroyed the country over the next few months. A trail of horror marked the path of the Greek army. Villages were in flames, fields and crops were destroyed, and the civilian population fled to the mountains. The Greek advance began to slow at the beginning of September. The Turkish defences on the Sakarya River managed to hold firm in face of attacks. The Greeks eventually had to retreat after some hard battles. The price that had to be paid for this victory was terrible. Thousands of young Turkish officers who'd fought on the front lines lost their lives. Although the Allies were attempting to save the threatening defeat of the Greeks by diplomatic means, Mustafa Kemal was preparing the final blow against the occupiers. Without knowing about these plans, the Greeks were engaged in creating new plans in the areas they were occupying. At the end of June 1922, the government in Athens ordered the Greek commissioner in Izmir to declare the independent state of Ionia in West Anatolia. Mustafa Kemal made one last attempt to avoid the oncoming war. He requested his friend Fethi Bey to talk to the British Premier Lloyd George and to get the Greek government to agree to a peaceable withdrawal from Asia Minor. But it was all in vain. Athens was keen to achieve a military decision. It was on the 20th of August 1922 that Mustafa Kemal arrived at his headquarters in Aksahir, where 15 Turkish divisions had taken up position. His plan was to smash through the Greek front in the area around Afyonkarahisar, from the south in fact. Because the area was generally considered to be impossible to attack because of its rough terrain, the Greeks hadn't bothered to station many troops there. The most important strategic objective of the attack was the railway line running through the region. Should the attack be successful, the Greek units would have their important supply line cut. The Turkish artillery batteries opened fire in the early hours of the morning on the 26th of August. After the barrages of fire, 12 infantry and 3 cavalry divisions moved forward to attack. The Greek front was completely overrun within 48 hours. Afyonkarahisar fell into Turkish hands on the 29th of August, and the decisive battle was won by the Turks at Dunlumpinat on the 30th of August. Today, this day is celebrated by the Turks as a national holiday. The Greek army fled westwards in the direction of Izmir. During their retreat, they destroyed the main parts of Uşak and Manisa. Hundreds of Turkish villages and small towns went up in flames. As the Turks continued their advance, the Greek retreat turned into a disaster. Tens of thousands of Greek soldiers were taken prisoner, and the rest fled to ships lying in the harbour in Izmir. Izmir was also put to the torch. The victorious Turkish army marched into Izmir on the 9th of September. Commander Serif personally hoisted the Turkish flag on the roof of the town hall. When Mustafa Kemal, together with Marshal Fevzi Çakmak and General İsmet İnönü, made an appearance on the town hall balcony, the people cheered them. Following this victory, Mustafa Kemal turned his attention to the Dardanelles and Istanbul, which was still occupied by the Allies. An important step towards freeing these areas came with the signing of the Mudanya Agreement, which was signed on the 11th of October 1922 by representatives from Ankara, France and Italy. It was laid down that the Greeks should withdraw their troops behind the Maritsa within 14 days. Thrace should come under Turkish administration at the beginning of December 1922. The Gallipoli Peninsula and the zone around Istanbul should remain under Allied administration until a final peace agreement had been signed. And thus, the war was ended. Mustafa Kemal resigned as Supreme Commander of the Turkish army in order to concentrate on the political and social reforms in Turkey. His first task was to bring the Ottoman Empire to an end. On the 1st of November 1922, the Turkish National Assembly passed the following document. The Ottoman Empire no longer exists. A new state has been created, and the Constitution lays down that the people alone have the power. Laws must follow the power of the people, and the Sultanate is now history. The government in Istanbul is not legal. Istanbul and its surrounding areas belong under the influence of the government in Ankara. The cabinet in Istanbul is dissolved 3 days later. The national government takes over the administration of the former capital on the Bosphorus. Then, on the 16th of November, charges accusing Sultan Fahrettin of treason are laid. He, together with his son and some servants, flee the country on board the British warship Malaya. The Lausanne Peace Agreement is signed on the 24th of July 1923. It brings an end to the disarray and suffering of the years just past. Greece and Bulgaria have to accept the pre-war borders. The eastern border remains, as it was agreed on with the Soviets in 1921. For the Turks, this agreement means complete legal acceptance of Turkey as a sovereign, independent state. Mustafa Kemal has managed to achieve his main aim, and his country is free from foreign occupying forces. Parallel to the negotiations in Lausanne, Mustafa also began with social change in Turkey. It was on the 29th of January 1923 that he married a 25-year-old girl by the name of Latifa. His wife is a modern, intelligent and emancipated woman. The wedding took place strictly according to Kemalism views that state and religion should be separated. There was no religious wedding ceremony and no Muslim cleric was present. The new ideas didn't find overall consent in Turkey. Above all, in rural parts of the country, clerics had much support from the local people. The religion had dominated the people's way of living and the laws for centuries. Atatürk knew that the old system could not be changed in just a few months. In order to push forward development, Atatürk and his wife deliberately appeared in modern Western-style dress when making public appearances. It was recognition of the new times and a deliberate break with the old Osman traditions. But being married didn't really fit in with Mustafa Kemal's world. Just 2 years later, he applied for divorce. It was on the 29th of October 1923 that Mustafa Kemal called a republic into being. He, the 42-year-old, was unanimously elected the first president of Turkey by parliament. His comrade-in-arms and friend, İsmet İnönü, was awarded the job of minister-president. Mustafa Kemal then created the Republican People's Party to head the Kemalism movement. He wanted to use the party to come to grips with the tasks facing them in the future. Because Istanbul and its strategic geographical position on the Bosphorus was easy to reach by foreign powers, he decided to make Ankara the capital of Turkey. Surrounded by hundreds of kilometers of territory in Anatolia, the city was able to offer the Turkish government both security and political freedom. But even Mustafa Kemal was not a person to take a rest. He travelled continually around the country, speaking to the people and winning them over to the social reformation of the country along Western lines. It was in March 1924 that the Caliphate was disbanded and the members of the Osman monarchy were forced to leave the country. 1925 sees the wearing of the fez, the traditional Turkish head covering, banned, as well as the chador and the turban. Mustafa Kemal felt that these kinds of clothing represented no progress at all. Western clothing, on the other hand, personified social progress that his country badly needed in order to establish contact with Europe. In reality, all the old film material from Istanbul at the time seemed to mirror an Oriental atmosphere and not a European metropole. The Gregorian calendar, which begins with the birth of Christ, was introduced as the official way of registering time in the same year. Later saw the Swiss civil law system replace the old legal system dominated by the Koran. Men and women were seen as equal, and polygamy was done away with. The marriage ceremonies were carried out in a kind of registry office. In an attempt to promote the country's economy, Turkey's infrastructure was improved and the railways extended. Mustafa Kemal used a congress of his Republican People's Party in October 1927 to make an appeal to the young people in Turkey, who had been of special interest to him from the beginning. Unmoved by criticism from fundamentalist religious circles in particular, he moved ahead with his reform policies. The Latin alphabet was introduced to replace the old Arabic script. Islamism lost its position as the state religion, and the religious schools for clerics and judges were dissolved. Every adult Turk had the right to choose his or her own religion. Women were granted equality and the same rights as men, and were thus given access to all areas of official life. Compulsory schooling was introduced to improve education. Universities, vocational training schools, libraries and museums were opened in the big cities. Even a conservatorium was opened in Ankara, which taught classical European music. Keep fit education and healthcare were allotted priority, which had been unknown up to then. Industry and agriculture made progress. The government supported the free market economy principles and private investment. The general well-being of the public improved considerably. In order to demonstrate his interest in the modernization of agriculture, the president used every opportunity to sit on a tractor himself and discuss various issues with the farmers. There was no area in the country that was being ignored, and no problems that the people themselves couldn't tell him about. In a move to turn Ankara into a modern city, Mustafa Kemal hired a German team of architects under the direction of Hermann Janssen to begin work on city planning. He took a personal interest in putting the planning into practice and often turned up unexpectedly to see how building work in Ankara was progressing. Within a few years, Ankara was changed into a blossoming city with modern buildings, wide streets and attractive squares. When Turkey gained membership of the League of Nations on the 18th of July 1932, even relations with the Western powers began to normalize. It was on the 29th of October 1933 that the Turkish Republic celebrated the 10th anniversary of its founding. The state founder gave a milestone speech to a large audience including many international guests. His speech ended with the words, "Happy is he who can say he is a Turk." The following celebrations presented an opportunity to demonstrate the successes achieved in the previous decade. Then, on the 14th of November 1934, the great Turkish National Assembly honored Mustafa Kemal with the surname Atatürk, or Father of all Turks. It was an honorary title that was his and his alone, and could not be earned by anyone else. The international community, too, recognized Atatürk's achievements. High-ranking statesmen presented their credentials. The Shah of Persia, Reza Pahlavi, paid a visit, as well as the British monarch King Edward VIII and King Abdullah of Jordan. Mustafa Kemal paid particular attention to German-Turkish relations. The joint recognition of their national identities helped to form the basis of the friendship. One of the first foreign policy steps taken following the Lausanne Peace Agreement was the renewal of diplomatic relations with Berlin. Ambassadors were exchanged in 1924. Over the next few years, economic ties were continually expanded. German loans and German experts helped to promote the industrialization of Turkey. Trade agreements and a friendship agreement put the seal on the excellent relations. The fact that Atatürk viewed the following political developments in Germany with a measure of reserve, and that Turkey allowed German immigrants from Hitler's Germany to settle there in the 1930s, including Ernst Reuter, a former governing mayor of Berlin, did nothing to cloud relations. When the Turkish ambassador, Cemalettin Gökçen, died in the middle of the 1930s, the body was returned home from Berlin with full honours. All the fighting and effort in the years just past had left their mark on Atatürk's health. He suffered more and more with headaches, tiredness and fever. At the end of 1936, his doctors diagnosed a lung embolism. His medical advisors were of the opinion that he should withdraw from daily political life. The main part of his time was spent in his villa in an area called Florya in Istanbul. He spent his time watching over the bringing up of his two adoptive children, met with guests, and attempted to regain his health. As his health continued to deteriorate, the Turkish leader drew up his last will and testament on the 5th of September 1938. He left his entire estate to his party. The monies gained from the administration of his estate were to go to his adopted children and allow the children of his old comrade in arms, İsmet İnönü, to go to university. His health deteriorated to such a degree that his doctors could no longer help him. He died just after 9 o'clock on the 10th of November 1938 in the Dolmabahce Palace in Istanbul. A truly great personality had come to the end of his life. But his ideals and ideas live on. His struggle for national freedom and his untiring effort towards an independent Turkey will not be forgotten in the face of Islamic fundamentalism.